Our topic this evening is one that you have all been kind of calling for a very dedicated lecture on, calling it the myth of David's kingdom, which is to say, what is the evidence for the historicity of a united kingdom of Judah and Israel under the kings Saul and David and Solomon, as described in the biblical narrative. And specifically, since I'm calling this the myth of that united kingdom, why the historical evidence, or why the evidence does not point to the historicity of that united kingdom, and especially not that Davidic or Solomonic empire. And this is not a lecture about debunking. That's not ever what we're going for or trying for. But this is an important for our understanding of the historical context of the stories of the Hebrew Bible, because this is sort of that liminal moment. We want to know often what portion of these stories found in the biblical text have historicity, and that transition moment really is this time period of David. David is sometimes referred to as the earliest biblical figure for whom there can be said to be historicity, and we'll see why that's not quite correct, but in broad strokes, this time period and earlier, things like the Exodus and Moses, the Exodus story doesn't have historicity as written. So in the sense that in the time period when Moses was said to have lived, let's say around the time of Ramses II of Egypt, there was no major event where, say, a third of the population resident in Egypt, as described in the book of Exodus, left and wandered 40 years in the Sinai and surrounding wilderness, and then appeared in the land of Canaan. There's no evidence for that, and in fact, that does not fit the rest of the record, where, again, that is the time period of an Egyptian empire where the Egyptians actually owned the land of Canaan, and so they wouldn't actually have left Egyptian rule by having made that move if such a move had even happened. So before this sort of time period of David, when we're getting into the book of Genesis and things like that, these are mythic stories that don't have historicity. But after the time of David's kingdom, we are getting into a place where we can find extra biblical evidence that shows that many of these figures do have a historical basis, and many of the events. And so grounding us in this moment is important, I think. So as a child growing up in the 1970s, long before there was anything like an internet, and you just had what books you had, one of the books my family had was a large Hammond World Atlas, and that was very influential for me in how I kind of first learned about how the world worked. I routinely just pored over that book and eventually broke its binding, ruined the book from overuse, but I looked at it all the time. And of course, there was the contemporary geography where I could look around at every place in the present day world. And as much as I liked that, I was actually especially fascinated by all the appendices at the end of the book. So this atlas included historical atlases. It's kind of a US history atlas and a world history atlas, although, from this time period, world history more or less meant European history, and then when Europeans started colonizing and conquering the world, well, then the world got involved in it, but other than that, not a lot of information about the rest of the world's history. Nevertheless, that was in the back there. There were also lots of charts and science, and one of the ones that I really stood out for me was how all of the different classes of species, amphibians and reptiles and dinosaurs and mammals and fish and so forth, how they all evolved from earlier forms. And so that was something that I was really fascinated by. And then I was just fascinated by these historical atlases and the fact that there was a biblical atlas at the end. This is one of the pages from it, which is showing essentially the transition in the upper left-hand corner from Roman Britain, the evacuation by the Roman legions, and the settlement of the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes in the right-hand, upper right, that lower left, leading to the classic model of England, Anglo-Saxon England under the Heptarchy, it's called, divided into 7 different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and then later here, Alfred the Great's dominion and the Danish part of England. So this was something I, like I say, pored over, and indeed, long before I had any narrative to go along with, let's say, ancient and medieval European history, I was very familiar with the maps because of how much I've always loved maps. And so I was also had a religious upbringing and was interested in the Bible, and so the biblical atlas was really interesting to me, and this is a page from it. In addition to this, there were the map that showed where the 12 tribes had their allocations, and I was interested in the lost 10 tribes and all that kind of thing. I was interested in, Galilee and the vicinity at the time of Jesus, how that all worked, and so forth. So this map shows, quote, the empire of David and Solomon, circa 1000 to 925 BC. And this one kind of stood out for me because it's a map that portrays, let's say, biblical lands, the Bible story, when they reach their greatest extent, this big empire of David and Solomon, the 2 great kings of the United Kingdom of Israel and Judah. So just putting this geography of that kingdom of Israel and Judah into context, when we think about the Levant, this area is sometimes called, let's say, Greater Syria. So Syria is a modern nation, but it didn't have, ancient Syria didn't have the boundaries that modern Syria has. Essentially, we're talking about the Fertile Crescent that stretches from Egypt up into the north, into Syria, across into Mesopotamia, and all the way down to the Persian Gulf in Iraq. That Fertile Crescent, the western part is the Levant, the eastern part is Mesopotamia, and that in turn is surrounded by Egypt, Anatolia or Asia Minor, what we now think of as Turkey, and Iran and Persia. And in fact, of all of these, the Levant here being in the middle, it's sort of the smallest of those major territories. Each one of those other ones, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, and Anatolia, are all bigger and are easier places to have a capital for a big empire than the Levant. And so in fact, usually in history, the Levant is not the center or capital for one of those empires. It'll usually be a place like Nineveh in Mesopotamia, or Babylon or Baghdad, which are all over in Mesopotamia, or up in Anatolia, like where Constantinople is, or even in Egypt, although Egypt isn't very good at creating empires either, but it was rich in any event. So Alexandria or Memphis, Cairo. So the Levant, it's really only during a particular period of time in the Umayyad Caliphate or Islam, when Damascus is sort of the capital, as they have an empire that's stretching from North Africa across through Central Asia, and they are trying very desperately to take over Anatolia and Constantinople from the Byzantines, but failing. That's the one moment when there's an empire had its capital there, but generally it doesn't. So that map that existed in my atlas that I had growing up in the 70s, that continues to exist. I did a little Google image search and I found a bunch of different variants of this, usually from Christian or Jewish religious sites, how do you understand the Bible kind of sites. And so you can kind of see here the Levant, the Western Fertile Crescent, and it's bounded fairly narrowly between the Mediterranean Sea and a vast Arabian desert. And the wider, larger part of this is what we now think of, as Syria up in the north, and the smaller, thinner part, which we now think of as Israel and Palestine down in the south. And so that's sort of the kind of the zone that we'll be talking about. And in both cases here, this is these maps are claiming this is Solomon's kingdom at its greatest extent. So the additional areas here are what he inherited from, and then from his father, according to the biblical narrative, and what he expanded his dominion to. So from the border of Egypt to the Euphrates River. The single source for this map is the Bible, and specifically it's the account in 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 20 through 28. So this account actually, though, covers a part of the Old Testament where the Hebrew text of the Bible is actually different. The source material is different from what we have in the Septuagint, the Greek version of it. So the Septuagint is missing a couple verses that are in the Hebrew version, or maybe what that means is when the Septuagint was first translated from an earlier Hebrew version, no one had inserted these extra verses yet. It's hard to exactly say, but let's read what's in the Hebrew first. So Judah and Israel under Solomon were as numerous as the sand by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. This is a golden age. Solomon was sovereign over all of the kingdoms from the Euphrates in Mesopotamia to the land of the Philistines on the coast of the Mediterranean, even to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and they served Solomon all the days of his life. So the next portion is in the Septuagint, and so this is part that's in either version of the text. Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of choice flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowl. So he has an enormous court and enormous capital, and they're eating like just a lot of animals worth of food. If you can imagine how many people you'd need to eat 20 pasture-fed cattle and 100 sheep, in a day, much less all this choice flour and meal and gazelles and things. For he had dominion over all of the region west of the Euphrates. And so then the Hebrew part includes a little bit more description here, from Tifsa to Gaza, and over all of the kings west of the Euphrates. So that's not in the Septuagint. And he had peace on all sides. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan, which is a town in the north of Israel, to Beersheba, which is a town in the south of Judah, all of them under their vines and their fig trees. Like I say, this is being portrayed here as the ultimate golden age. Solomon also had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. Those officials supplied provisions for King Solomon and for all who came to King Solomon's table, each one in his month. They let nothing be lacking. They also brought to the required place barley and straw for the horses. We don't think it's just what we're eating with all of the courtiers, officials, and army and everything like that. We also have to feed the horses and swift steeds, each according to his charge. So the biblical account here is talking about Solomon as being at the center of a vast empire, and it is a vast empire that is marshaling all of the resources through tribute and centralizing that. And so that is really important. So essentially this is describing dominion over everything west of the Euphrates, the trans-Euphratine area of the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East. So although, like I say, the Hebrew variant here makes more detailed claims, Actually, both versions state that Solomon exercised hegemony over the whole Levant west of the Euphrates. So 1 Kings, where we just read from, is part of the Bible's Deuteronomistic histories. So the earliest that a first edition of these books, the Deuteronomistic histories, might have been composed was during the reign of King Josiah of Judah at the very end of the 7th century. But many scholars believe it's written much later, so during the period of the Babylonian exile, after Jerusalem and Judah have been destroyed by the Babylonians, or even post-exile, by the time we get to the Persian period, when the exiles are allowed to come back and rebuild the temple. We definitely know it was edited after Josiah's time, even if there was an early version that was dating to that time, and changes are being made into the Persian period. And that's why in the very verses that we just read, there are variations. So maybe the very first time that anybody would have had access to the books as we have them now is around the time of Ezra in the Persian period. But by the time a couple centuries later they're being translated into Greek, there's still variations happening. So that's why the final version isn't necessarily even to us at that point. The narrative of David and Solomon form a really core part of these Deuteronomistic histories. Like I say, these are divided into the books Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. Because all of these books have a similar theme, similar theology, similar editorial interests, like I say, they're generally understood by scholars to be part of the same school of thought, which is also in line with the books of Deuteronomy and of Jeremiah. And so this is why scholars call these the Deuteronomistic histories. These are not really histories, but they're meant to be, or they're put in the form of a history. It's before the invention of even the ancient discipline of history that these are being composed. But they are like chronicles and so on. They're in line with the thinking of writers like Jeremiah and whoever is also contemporaneously composing the book of Deuteronomy. And this all is dated to the end of the kingdom of Judah. So Jeremiah is alive during the reign of Josiah and lives on after him. And he's still alive after the destruction of Jerusalem. And so it's possible that this school is associated with him. But it's unlikely that any of this existed much earlier. So if we look at this, one of the things that when we're trying to find historicity, or when we're seeing what's the likelihood that a particular event in a text actually happened, what I always say is that the context in ancient texts and medieval texts is almost always actually really what the context of the time of the author, not the time that they are trying to look back in time to write, because they are not historians in any kind of modern sense. They lack all of the tools that we have in order to find what really happened. And in a lot of cases, they're not actually trying to find what really happened. They have other agendas that they're using to write, usually trying to, in this case, teach moral philosophies, to understand identity, tell people, give a sense of where they came from, and so on. So in this particular case, if we look at this timeline, which I've taken here from 1000 before the Common Era to 400, the period when the United Kingdom of Judah and Israel under David and Solomon might have existed, could be dated sometime from, let's say, the year 1000 or 1010 to the year 931, let's say. How do we get those dates? The Bible is not counting down backwards and saying, we're now to the year 931 BC. It's not, nobody was dating that way. There's no one way things date. The way calendars worked in this time period is everybody had their own calendar, essentially, and they usually numbered the years based on the reign of the king. And so they will say, this happened in the 3rd year of the reign of King Solomon. This happened in the 12th year of the reign of King Solomon. And so the way people in modern times have tried to take a biblical text and get to what date Solomon might have reigned is by adding up all of those different regnal years that we hear about until you can go backwards and get to those dates. And so as a result, nobody actually has, even based on the Bible, like one fixed number. I'm just taking, there's many multiple different versions that are published, and I've just kind of taken arbitrarily one of them. So these are not meant to be perfect, but they are actually based on the biblical text rather than any outside history. So if we take that kind of time frame for when the United Kingdom of Judah and Israel, as described in the Bible, was supposed to exist, and then if we take it to the time period when anybody might have actually first had access to reading the Deuteronomistic histories and the Torah and so on, which was after the exile's return and the Persian period, let's say, it's at least 400 years. If we're trying to get down to Ezra's time when things are still being maybe edited and changed, it could be as much as 500 years. So this is a very long gap for, let's say, collective memory to survive in any kind of detail. It's possible for information to be translated through oral tradition, of course, over this, but the Deuteronomic histories are not like an epic poem. They're not like Homer, where oral poets are memorizing this. These are textual, so they wouldn't be able to have survived through oral tradition in this case. Even if we assigned the Deuteronomistic history to the earliest date possible, let's say to the reign of King Josiah, which I mentioned, and I tend to think that this is completely possible, we're still talking about 300 years from the time period when they happened to Josiah, which is too long for memory, or there's no oral tradition here that we know of, but it is possible that there was earlier written records. So while the reigns of the final kings of Judah, at a time just decades before it was composed, so the final parts of Kings and 2nd Kings, that's pretty close to when the text was composed, and so people are aware of that. It's probably having some fairly good historicity by the time we're getting to the end of 2nd Kings. Everything that goes before that, though, all the way back to 1st Kings, and certainly if we go all the way back to Joshua, these are very far removed, centuries and many more centuries to get to Judges and Joshua. Nevertheless, when you read the Deuteronomistic histories, it'll sometimes say, is this not written in the book of Jashar or something like that? And so they are referencing texts that the author here, or the editor, whoever is composing these histories, they may have had access to much older written texts. So there could have been annals, there could have been king lists that were kept in the royal archives and so forth. So it's just because there's this much time period, it doesn't mean automatically there's no way any of this has any historicity. But it does mean we have to be very, very cautious when there has been this 300 years or 400 years elapse. It starts to be more questionable. So like I say, given the late date of the biblical account, to show historicity, we actually need then extra biblical evidence, something that is outside the Bible that helps us establish whether this Davidic empire, the Solomonic empire, actually existed, or whether it's simply a myth, this Golden Age myth, that someone was writing about much later. So in addition to building the Jerusalem temple and his neighboring palace, the Bible describes Solomon engaging in all kinds of other significant building projects. And building projects tend to leave remains, which will give us the ability for extra biblical evidence through the discipline of archaeology. So let's read about a couple of these. In 1 Kings chapter 9, we read, "This is the account of the forced labor that King Solomon conscripted to build the house of the Lord, to build the Jerusalem temple, and his own house, the palace of the king right next to the Jerusalem temple, the Millo and the wall of Jerusalem. And then it says also, and to build Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. So it explains, what do they mean by that? Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and captured Gezer and burned it down. He'd killed all the Canaanites who lived in that city, and he'd given it as a dowry to his daughter when he gave his daughter to Solomon as a wife. So Solomon rebuilt Gezer. Lower Beth-horon, Baalath, Tadmor in the wilderness within the land, as well as all of Solomon's storage cities, the cities for his chariots, the cities for his cavalry, and whatever Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem and Lebanon and into all the land of his dominion. So he's a great builder, according to this section of the Book of Kings. So, like I say, using this account where it says specifically Solomon fortified sites at Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer, archaeologists in the mid-20th century began looking at these ancient tells, these old sites where ancient cities are built up layer upon layer, and you start digging down into them in order to find the ancient cities that were once at those sites. And those archaeologists, many of them believed that they'd actually found what they were looking for at those sites. So when they went to Megiddo, Hazor, and Gezer, each of them were found to have a really particular type of city gate, or a gate to the fortifications, which are these gates you can see have 6 chambers. And so there's a door and you have to pass through, and multiple doors to create a defensive structure. So the fact that there were very similar structures at each of these 3 cities implied, okay, maybe these were all part of a building program of a single state, maybe even a single king who was responsible for this whole territory did that. And again, because the Bible credits Solomon as a great builder, these archaeologists immediately labeled these gates as Solomonic. They were seen as evidence of his reign. Specifically, the Bible doesn't say Solomon built these gates. Each of it has 6 chambers, so that part of it is not, explicit. But just the fact that they existed in these cities seemed to these archaeologists to indicate, okay, this is evidence for Solomon's kingdom. Unfortunately, though, the gates have no explicit reference to Solomon. So it doesn't say Solomon built me or something like that, unfortunately, on the gate. And in fact, actually, there are no pre-biblical, extra-biblical references to Solomon. So, given again that he reigns for 40 years and he has this amazing extent of his empire from the border of Egypt to the Euphrates, he's the son-in-law of the Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and also he marries so many other royal women and princesses from other surrounding kingdoms, yet none of these kingdoms mention him at all in any of their records, unfortunately. So even though we have those gates, you can see at the center of this map, I've kind of added where Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer are, that may establish, I say, a king reigning at this area, but it doesn't specifically identify that it's Solomon, so it isn't actually proof of Solomon's historicity. And it's also really not evidence that there was an empire that reached from the Euphrates to Egypt. It does mean that there was potentially a strong state or maybe a king reigning in that area. That might be one argument you could make with those. What is some of the extra biblical evidence we have for the later kings of Israel and Judah? So, as you're probably aware, in the biblical account, there's initially, Moses and Joshua are the leaders over the 12 tribes of Israel. And then in the period of the Judges, the book of Judges, the tribes are ruled by various chiefs called judges, people like Samson, who was a very strong but not a very smart or effective judge, until we get to the very last judge, Samuel, who, against his better instincts, just fulfilled what the people wanted. The people wanted to have to be ruled over by a king, like all of their neighbors were. And so Samuel, the last judge, anoints a guy named Saul, whose major qualification for that he had was that he was super tall. He was a head taller, it says, than everybody else. And then later, when Saul didn't seem to be working out as far as the Lord was concerned, Samuel appointed David as kings over the Israelites, according to the biblical account. So then after the death of David, his successor, after the death of David's successor, Solomon, David's son, this kingdom then, according to the biblical account, was split into two parts, Israel and Judah, and then thereafter, for centuries, they each have their own royal lines, their own dynasties. So we'd had this idea, let's going back here to the amount of time between that united kingdom of Judah and Israel and getting down to the reign of Josiah. So let me just fill that same time period in. So here's the United Kingdom, and we have over on the left, I have it in pink, the kings of that. So Saul, who is replaced and supplanted by David, and so his time period overlaps with David. Saul also, in the biblical account, has a son, Esbal, who is able to continue to reign for a little while David is, I guess, the true king. And then after David, Solomon. And so then after Solomon, the kingdom is divided into the two parts. And thereafter, in the north, and I have here in the blue, we have all of the reigns of the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel. So starting with Jeroboam the first, and including important kings like Omri, and especially the king Ahab, who is married to Jezebel. They're the great rivals of the prophet Elijah, and so on all the way through Jeroboam II, who has a long reign, and down until we get to Hoshea, who is defeated by the king of Assyria, who conquers the northern kingdom and destroys Samaria, Israel, and incorporates it then into the Assyrian Empire. Meanwhile, in the south, the house of David, Solomon's descendants, continue to rule on the throne in Jerusalem, but over a little rump kingdom of Judah, and that includes then all of these kings have the famous names like Jehoshaphat, and all the way down to then towards the end, middle end here, Hezekiah, who's famous for initiating a religious reform that may have been the beginnings of monolatry, and then the precursor to monotheism, kind of the change of Israelite religion, Hebrew religion, from the kind of Canaanite paganism that it had always been to moving towards the world religion that many centuries later it develops into. Hezekiah's successor, Manasseh, who reversed everything, but nevertheless had a strong and prosperous rule. And then to Josiah, who was viewed anyway by the Bible as the best king since David, who again tried to bring everything from the Hezekiah reforms back into order, and indeed is present at the time when a book in the temple is found, which many scholars equate with Deuteronomy, and so the beginnings of the Deuteronomistic reforms, when prophets like Jeremiah are operative. But Josiah gets unexpectedly killed by Pharaoh, and so then his successors are not very glorious or strong, and indeed they're under the shadow at first of the Pharaoh, but then also of the kings of Babylon, until finally the last of them, Zedekiah, is carted off to Babylon in exile, and Jerusalem is destroyed. So you can kind of see then we have an entire kind of king list for both of these, from the end of the United Kingdom all the way to the fall of Samaria, the northern kingdom Israel, and the fall of Jerusalem, the southern kingdom Judah. So how good are these king lists? What extra biblical evidence exists for any of these names, for any of these characters outside of the Bible? And the answer is we actually have a fair amount of extra biblical evidence for kings of these names from the records of the surrounding peoples and or from archaeological artifacts, usually coming in the form of like a seal that has something, a name's written on it. And so I want to look at evidence that we have for 8 of these kings of Judah and 8 of these kings of Israel. And I'm going to go from the more recent ones getting all the way back to the more ancient ones, just to show where those are. So at the very end, King Jehoiakim of Judah, who is at the end of the 6th century, says, or not the end, he's in 598 to 597. He is taken, the beginning of the 6th century, so he's taken captive to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. Joachim is mentioned in the records of the Babylonian southern palace, so Babylonian records, and these record rations that are given to Joachim, king of the Judeans. So here he is, he's an exile, but he is part of the court of Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Babylonians, and as a result, he is on a pension, essentially, there. So we have that from the Babylonian sources. A predecessor, King Manasseh, I mentioned, that king who reversed all of the Hezekiah reforms and refilled the Jerusalem temple with all of the idols and temple prostitutes and so forth, all of the things that the reformers tried to get rid of. Manasseh is mentioned in the records of King Esarhaddon of Assyria, who lists him as among the allies who went with him and helped him during his conquest of Egypt. So the Assyrians, when they were on their rise, are one of the empires of the first empire to come in and conquer Egypt. And Manasseh is an ally of the Assyrians. And according to their records, he is among the kings who brought Esarhaddon gifts. So he's essentially a tributary. So the relationship is obviously one of Assyrians are the much greater power than the little kingdom of Judah. Hezekiah, we also have extra biblical evidence for. So he's that important king who is the reformer. The Assyrian king Sennacherib records that the Assyrians besieged Hezekiah the Judean at his capital, Jerusalem. I shut him up into Jerusalem, is what he said. So he's trying to put a best face on this war. But in fact, actually, the Assyrians were not able to conquer Jerusalem, even though they besieged it. In addition to the Assyrian records, we have a seal, a bulla, that was found, and it has the inscription that says, this seal belongs to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. And of course, that seal then also gives us evidence, extra biblical evidence, archaeological evidence for the existence of King Ahaz, Hezekiah's father. And in addition to that, he has one of his own that we have, a seal that has been found saying Ahaz, son of Jotham. So in addition to those seals, Ahaz is also in the records of the Assyrians. And so King Tiglath-Pileser III records that he received tribute from Jehoaz of Judah. King Uzziah of Judah, we also have evidence in the form of 2 stone seals that bear inscriptions that say that they are belonging to 2 of his ministers. So the one says, I'm belong to Abiah, minister of Uzziah, and one says, I belong to Shobneah, minister of Uzziah. The problem with these two is that they lack provenance. In other words, they weren't found in any archaeological site. Some grave robber or something found them somewhere, dug them up, and they were found in a marketplace or something. So that always is problematic in terms of being able to date them or make sure they're not forgeries. We also have extra biblical evidence for King Ahaziah of Judah and King Jehoram of Judah, and these are much earlier 9th century kings. So Ahaziah and his father Jehoram are referenced on the Tel Dan Stele, and so this stele is a 9th century monument. It's really important. That's inscribed in the old Aramaic language. So we're often familiar with, when we talk about Aramaic normally, we're thinking of the language that is the kind of lingua franca of the Levant during the lifetime of Jesus, the language that would have been his, that he would have spoken. Aram is the area that we think of as Syria. So the kingdom of Damascus is called Aram. And so this old Aramaic is this language that is spoken, way back in this time period that later evolved into the Aramaic we think of, that later evolves into Syriac. So this king has put up, we don't know who it is, that part of the stele is destroyed. It can be inferred who it is, but anyway, it doesn't say. This king of Aram Damascus is recording his great victories that he's had over kings of both Judah and Israel on this stela. And so we only have a little fragment of it. We don't have the whole thing. But part of it says, I killed Jehoram, probably. We don't have the whole Jeho part. I killed Jehoram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and I killed Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, king of the house of David, and I set their towns into ruins and turned their land into desolation. So the interesting thing here then is the stele lists both the kings of both Israel and Judah, of them kind of fighting side by side, in this case against the king of Aram, the king of Damascus, and also in it talking about Jehoram, king of the house of David. This is the earliest biblical source for the idea that there's a house of David. So the idea that the kings of Judah, the kings of Jerusalem, are understood to be from a royal house that understands itself to be named the house of David. And so this of David part is why some people say, well, there's also an extra biblical reference here to David, since David is a biblical figure, and we have the name here. We'll talk about that. So if we go now from those are the kings of Judah, different extra biblical evidence we have for them, both in the records of their contemporaries and then also in artifacts, archaeological artifacts that they might have had. We also have extra biblical evidence for the kings of Israel, the kings of Samaria, the northern kingdom. So for example, King Hoshea, the last of them, in the records of King Tilgath-Pileser, the third of Assyria, who conquered Israel, he records that Hoshea was put into his power in his annals. So he destroyed that kingdom and he took the king. King Menahem of Israel, we also read in Tilgath-Pileser's third's records, the Assyrian records, that Menahem had been paying him tribute. So again, before the Assyrians ultimately conquer you, they bleed you by making you a tributary state, and that's what's going on here. King Jeroboam II of Israel, we mentioned is sort of long-lived. His name is inscribed on an 8th century seal, and that seal was owned by someone named Shema, the servant of Jeroboam. We have King Jehoash of Israel, who is mentioned in Assyrian records again by King Adad-Nirari III. So he says Jehoash of Samaria is one of the people that is listed in the annals. King Jehu of Israel is mentioned on a monument, an Assyrian monument called the Black Obelisk. And so this obelisk commemorates the deeds of King Shalmaneser III of Assyria. And so in this, Shalmaneser III boasts, "I received tribute from Jehu, son of the people of the land of Omri, silver, gold, a golden bowl, a golden vase with a pointed bottom, golden tumblers, a golden buckets, tin, a staff for a king, and spears." So all kinds of treasure and luxury goods. This king Jehu, and it doesn't say here of Israel or Samaria, but instead it calls it the people of the land of Omri. And this figures into Assyrian records often. Omri becomes their shorthand in the same way that we saw House of David as shorthand for the kings of Jerusalem. House of Omri is associated with Israel. So Jehoram of Israel is also, as we saw, listed on that Tel Dan fragment is what I'm trying to say, the Tel Dan Stele. So it said, like we saw in Aramaic, that the king of Aram Damascus wrote, "I killed Jehoram, son of Ahab, king of Israel." So that's an example of extra-biblical evidence for the historicity of Jehoram of Israel. King Ahab, that famous king married to Jezebel, according to the Bible, the great antagonist of Elijah. There is a monolith, the Kirk monolith that is in Assyrian. On that monolith, Ahab is listed along with 10 other kings who formed an alliance against King Shalmaneser III of Assyria. So one of the problems, as I mentioned, with the Levant, with the western part of the Fertile Crescent, is it's smaller, and it's actually also usually not united. And so there's all of these little kingdoms compared to the much bigger kingdom that is existing over in Mesopotamia, where in this case the Assyrians have more or less conquered all of Mesopotamia and have this giant empire that they are coming to battle with the Levant. So in order to try to resist, in this case, the Kirk monolith says 12 kings came together to fight against Shalmaneser. It only lists 11 of them by name, but it says 12. And then one of those it says is King Ahab of Israel sent 2,000 chariots and 10,000 soldiers. So that's a very considerable force. He was one of the larger contingents according to the Assyrian records. So, which implies that that Ahab is ruling around maybe at the height of Israel's power, and the fact that it's listing so many chariots also may associate the northern kingdom of Israel with a lot of horsepower. And something that the Bible narrative does and associates with Solomon in terms of building all those stables, as we saw, and having all of those horsemen and things. But the records here, extra-biblical records here, assign that to a later time period and not to the United Kingdom, but rather to the northern kingdom, to Ahab's kingdom. So Ahab's father, King Omri of Israel, is also mentioned, or it's his ancestor, I guess, is also mentioned with his unnamed son or successor on the Moabite Mesha stele. Or it could be his son is that, I have to look at it. Anyway, dated around 840 BCE, this stele was erected by King Meshe of Moab. So Moab is just a little tiny kingdom in terms of the size. It's not much different from Judah, a little smaller, on the other side of the Dead Sea. In this case, the stele is inscribed in Canaanite, which is very similar to Paleo-Hebrew. The text tells how Moab was oppressed for 40 years by Omri, king of Israel, and his son, and that angered the god Chemosh. And then with the mercy of Chemosh and the help of Chemosh, Meshi, king of the Moabites, fought battles against the Israelites and was able to kind of push them out of parts of the land and restore Moab's defenses and fortifications. It says in one point, that it was that they were being oppressed for 40 years. And the idea that this cycle where where foreigners come and oppress you for 40 years until God essentially raises up a deliverer and pushes them out, is almost exactly the same as the Deuteronomistic cycle that we read about in the book of Judges. The only difference here is that the Israelites are the bad guys instead of the Moabites, like in the book of Judges. And the god here is Chemosh, whereas Chemosh is the enemy god in the Moabite stele. And in Meshe's account, he takes all of these vessels and sacramental things from Yahweh, and he brings it to Chemosh. So, from the Israelites anyway, and gives it to Chemosh. So, like I said, the name Omri also became the Assyrian shorthand from of Israel, and so going back to that black obelisk, we zoom in on this picture that's on the obelisk. We have the Assyrian kings here standing, whereas the Israelite king is kneeling and prostrating himself, putting his nose to the ground to show total submission to the Assyrian kings. And it says here, Jehu of the land of the people of Omri, and then it's bowing here before Shalmaneser III. Okay, so that's, a lot. I went through a bunch of steles, a bunch of different annals from both, the Moabites and the Aramites, and also the Assyrians, especially, as there are different extra-biblical contemporary records. And then we also see that a certain number, anyway, of ancient seals have been dug up, which also give us a bunch of king names. And so it's actually, a pretty good amount of extra-biblical, I think, confirmation for the existence of these two lines, or these two different kingdoms with their various kings that we have sort of preserved in the Deuteronomistic histories, the kings of the northern kingdom of Samaria, Israel, and the southern kingdom of Jerusalem, Judah. But just because we have that doesn't necessarily mean that we have this evidence for a united kingdom of Saul, Esbal, David, and Solomon. So what about David and Solomon? So we saw that the Tel Dan Stele provided evidence that kings of Judah, as early as the middle of the 9th century, that they were from a family that called itself the House of David. However, that does not necessarily mean or provide any evidence for the historicity of David himself, who, by the biblical account, would have lived over a century earlier than that stele. So it still isn't getting us to within spitting distance of David, really. It's a little too far there. And often, a royal house will have, a house name, an august name. And so, for example, the Merovingian kings of the Franks are named that because of an ancestor that they looked back to, Merovech. But again, we don't know much about Merovech. Legends are written about him later because of how important the Merovingians became. But it's problematic to have the historicity about it. So the historicity is to the name of the royal house. And in fact, there's actually no contemporary extra-biblical records for David's reign over a century before this House of David mention. So in other words, we have, I think, plenty of evidence for the historicity of both the Omrid kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom Samaria, and also the Davidic kingdom of Judah, Jerusalem, including some pretty good support for the biblical king lists that we have, and even the historicity then of many of the kings, even not important kings of that period. Doesn't mean that every single thing that happened in the biblical account about them is historically accurate or anything like that. The Deuteronomistic history is, it has a very kind of partisan bent, and it's entirely all about the idea of, if you are following the Hezekiah Josiah reforms of stamping out polytheism, it says that you are a good king, and when you are instead promoting polytheism, when you're promoting the worship of many gods, you're a bad king. But that reform itself, in as much as the Deuteronomistic reformers retroject that back in, that's all anachronism. So they are very interested in that agenda because they are the reformers themselves who are promoting that agenda, or their heirs in the exile and Persian periods that are still promoting that monotheism, monolatry, moving towards what we think of later as Judaism, but was not really practiced in the First Temple period that way. So that's their goal and agenda, and so their goal and agenda is not actually to try to trace exactly what really happened. So, given all of that positive evidence that we have for the relatively unimportant kings of this little hill kingdom of Judah, I think it would be very remarkable, that a great empire, one of the only times, in fact, that the Western Levant is all united together and is the center and has a great empire like this, that it would be remarkable that such an empire led by, I'd say, two kings that are not just, it's not like it's led by a little bureaucracy or it falls right apart. David and Solomon each reigned 40 years according to the Bible. So for them to have done that and been so great and to have all of this power and then leave no extra biblical record is pretty hard to imagine. Like I said, the Bible says that Solomon made alliances from as far away as Sheba. He's married to the Pharaoh's daughter. Nobody in Sheba or Egypt or anywhere, the Assyrians, Babylonians, nobody puts them in their records, whoever the contemporaries powers in Mesopotamia are. In addition to that, that's negative evidence, so we don't have anybody mention them. Okay, but in addition to that silence, there is significant evidence to doubt the existence of a united kingdom of Israel and Judah under David and Solomon. In the first place, administering a vast Iron Age empire required a very large capital city. The city had to have storehouses to receive tribute, barracks for armies, stables for chariots. Essentially, you had to be a city like Babylon or Nineveh in Assyria. We just even read in the book of Kings, that account of how many animals had to be brought in and slaughtered and eaten by Solomon's court and his armies and all his officials and everything like that in just a single day. This is an enormous undertaking that would have required a very big city with storehouses and everything like that. However, the Bible is also clear that David made his capital in Jerusalem and Solomon's capital was there. He was building that area up. And all of our archaeological evidence that we have shows that in David's era, Jerusalem remained a relatively small little hill town, nothing like the size needed to govern an empire, nothing like the ability to have and process all of those animals that are listed in the account that we read. Some traditionalists who would like this to be historical argue, well, we can't do all the archaeology that you want to in Jerusalem because that would start a terrible war. There's already terrible wars going on there, and it would incense everybody if we were allowed to dig all of this historic city up, and so there hasn't been sufficient archaeological study. However, it's not just Jerusalem. So we're also having Judah itself as the center of this empire. And the reality is that Jerusalem, as this capital of Judah, that the whole area in the time period when Solomon and David would have been alive, all of our studies of all of the sites in Judah also show that they were all small and relatively unpopulated, underpopulated, especially compared to the much more prosperous kingdom of Samaria at that time. So in David's time, there's no sense at all that, again, Jerusalem is anything but a pretty little town, and same thing for the entire country around it. In fact, so if we look at, go from this map to this, this little part where the city even was, or the town even was in David's time, that's not in what we now think of as the old city of Jerusalem. This is in the present day, as a Palestinian neighborhood that is south of the Ottoman walls, the walls that exist now as the old walls. But if we can kind of see where that is, I've marked it here as the original city of David. Where it's up there, this is Jerusalem as it would have looked after the northern kingdom falls. So after the northern kingdom falls, exiles come. Judah is integrated into the commercial system of the Assyrians. Judah now suddenly does become prosperous. Jerusalem grows now for the very first time. So that original little town of city of David grows. The temple now is much upgraded by the time of Josiah. That area up there where you see the temple is, that's actually the southern end of the wall now in the current old city, the Ottoman walls. So this original city of David part isn't part of the old city. And then that had also expanded into some of the rest of, again, south of, but into where the present old city is. So it's like I say, only after the fall of the much more prosperous northern kingdom that the hill country of Judah becomes more populated, and it's only at this time that Jerusalem expands and is actually the center of not an empire, still not big enough for that, but of a kingdom that is more than just a little backwater. I mean, it's still kind of a little backwater, but anyway, it's bigger than it ever had been. So what we can say then is, during all of that early development time, Israel was Samaria, the center of Yahwism, the center of this emerging Israelite religion is first in the northern kingdom, which is Samaria, not Judah. So to the extent that there was any sense of there's a united kingdom, it would just be that Judah is a tributary component of the northern kingdom, not that Jerusalem had always been the capital and the northern kingdom broke away or something like that. Again, the area up there was richer, more populated. Samaria was a more significant city. And so when we are looking then at that Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer, those three cities where we have so-called Solomonic gates, those are all, as you see, in the northern kingdom. You can maybe see, this is very tiny to see, but Hazor's at the top, Gezer's at the bottom, Megiddo is kind of in the middle. And so those are all within the northern kingdom. And so rather than giving evidence for a strong state under Solomon, it probably more likely gives evidence that there was a strong state under the Omride dynasty, Omri and his son Ahab especially, who are called out in the Moabite stele and who made their name such that even the Assyrians remembered them and called this area the house or the land of Omri. Okay, so if it's a myth, why then, why did this myth get created? The extra biblical evidence, conclusively, I think we can say there was no Solomonic empire. There's not this empire from the Euphrates to Egypt, but there really is no, I think we can discount the idea that there was ever a historically existing United Kingdom of Israel and Judah under David. So again, that directly contradicts the biblical narrative in the book of Kings. And so why would biblical authors create a myth, for example, that the eponymous ancestor of the kings of Jerusalem, that David had once ruled over this fallen northern kingdom of Israel? So this story gets created long after the kingdom of Israel no longer exists. Why create the story? Well, let's look into the context again of that rise of Judah after Samaria's fall. And so this is a map then of the whole Fertile Crescent. You can see again here how much bigger Mesopotamia is, the heartlands of Assyria and Babylon, compared to the Levant part, and why it's so much harder for the Levant to be the center of the empire as a result of that. And there's also nothing stopping everybody from the east just racing right across. The Euphrates is maybe considered a border, but it's not like a mountain range. It's the center of a fertile river, so that you actually want to own both sides of it if you can. And so anyway, people charge across it fairly easily. So we can see here in the dark green the different provinces that are ruled by the Assyrians directly, and that includes 3 provinces that had used to be the northern kingdom. So Samaria, Megiddo, and Gilead there, the part that's across the Jordan. And then you can see client kingdoms, including Egypt, that had gotten conquered by the Assyrians, but also the very little client kingdom of Judah, Ammon, Moab, and Edom. And so this is the rise of Judah when it's a client kingdom of this great Assyrian empire and part of that commercial system. And so here's the zoom in of that. Judah and its other neighbors that are client kingdoms, along with its former neighbors, both the Philistines and also the Israelites that are ruled directly and by Assyrian governors. So like I say, although when we look at biblical maps, and certainly the biblical map in my Hammond Atlas of the Bible that I saw growing up, they tend to emphasize this independence of the kingdom of Judah from the destruction of Israel. But from the destruction of the kingdom of Israel, Judah really was a client of Assyria, sometimes more under Assyria's thumb, sometimes less. So within that sphere, Judah really prospered, Jerusalem developed, and its Davidic kings welcomed exiles from the destroyed northern kingdom. We've looked at a lot of these chronologies, so just want to look at this one just to see the kind of major periods. So we have that mythical United Monarchy period. We have a period where you can see where the Assyrian Empire is existing and Israel still exists as a tributary state, and Judah, and then we have Israel ceasing to exist and Judah continuing to exist. Then we have the Babylonians who overthrow the Assyrians and displace them. And then as Babylon rises, they ultimately destroy the kingdom of Judah. And so it's this very end time period after the Assyrians are in great decline and before the Babylonians come back and ultimately destroy Jerusalem. That's the moment where Hezekiah and Josiah, especially there's a wealth in Jerusalem and enough to patronize writers, including this great literary output that is the beginning, essentially, of the biblical tradition. So substantial construction in Jerusalem as a royal center corresponds with this remarkable literary output. And like I say, this activity does not correspond at all to the reigns of David and Solomon, but instead to Hezekiah, Manasseh, and Josiah, and then beyond, as people retain or try to preserve that tradition. So just to look at that in closely because it's important. So Hezekiah, king of Judah from 715 to 787, these dates again are reconstructed from the Bible, so we don't know exactly, but around that time. So soon after the fall of Israel to Assyria, Hezekiah welcomed northern exiles into his growing court. Although he was forced to pay tribute, Hezekiah was able to successfully hold out against an Assyrian invasion. We saw that he's actually in the Assyrian records as not being conquered, as being besieged by the Assyrians. So Hezekiah's great religious reforms include monolatry, removing idols from the temple, destroying high places, so in other words, centralizing worship, destroying artifacts, according to the Bible, the Nehushtan, the staff of Moses, which was being used as far as the Deuteronomists were concerned for rituals that were pagan, like worshiping a staff. All of these acts of Hezekiah are celebrated by the biblical Deuteronomist historians. This was all reversed, like I say, by Hezekiah's son Manasseh, who had the longest and most successful reign in Judah's history, some 55 years. So in his time period, he reversed all of those reforms. He rebuilt the high places. He restored the idols of Asherah and Baal to the temple. He even revived the Canaanite practice of child sacrifice to Moloch, according to the Bible. And as a result of all of this, the Deuteronomist was not a fan of Manasseh. Nevertheless, the Deuteronomist's theology should have said that Manasseh should have actually been punished by God, which he was not. He prospered. It's only after his death that the Deuteronomist says, well, he was so bad, the Judah got punished after him. So, with the accession of Manasseh's grandson Josiah, the monolatrists regained power. Josiah destroyed the high places again. He cleansed the temple. And then he actually expanded Judah by going up into what had been the kingdom of Israel, kingdom of Samaria. And he took their southern shrine, the shrine of Bethel, the house of the Lord, a shrine associated with Jacob, the biblical patriarch Jacob, whose name is Israel. So in other words, a northern hero. This is the place where, according to the biblical text, Jacob, who is Israel, met God, the house of El. It's taken, and the shrine there is destroyed by Josiah. So Josiah's scribe, Hilkiah, then, is said in the Bible to have found a book of the law, or the Torah. And this is usually hypothesized to be the book of Deuteronomy, but it also could possibly be the book of Deuteronomy and the first edition of the Deuteronomistic histories. But in any event, some book now is found and is understood to be ancient and central to the practices that are now emerging at the beginning of the biblical tradition here. No king is as honored by the Deuteronomistic historian as Josiah. And this is one of the sources of evidence that the first version of the Deuteronomistic histories were composed during Josiah's reign, because these scribes who are composing them may be propagandists who are saying, this guy is the second David. This is the person we've been waiting for. Josiah is the only king in the Bible who is favorably compared to David. His works are written into the text also as a direct fulfillment of prophecy. So that destruction of the shrine of Bethel, the Deuteronomist goes back and inserts a prophecy that when the king of Israel actually built it, there was a prophecy at the time that it would eventually be destroyed by this great king who's going to come, Josiah. Nevertheless, even though the Deuteronomist would think, okay, this is the guy who should have the most long and successful reign, not Manasseh, who was the worst king ever according to our theology, Josiah was killed by Pharaoh Necho at Megiddo. So the promise that the Deuteronomist holds for his reign is unfulfilled. And so also the Davidic covenant that the Deuteronomist wrote, that the scepter shall never fall from the house of David, that also is broken. The house of David is essentially lost in a literal sense anyway. The literal interpretation of this prophecy failed, which is why people have then subsequently created new interpretations of the prophecy, both Christians and Jews. So Jeremiah, whose prophetic school is associated, like I say, with that Deuteronomistic history, that Deuteronomistic school. So traditionally, Jeremiah is also understood to be the author of the books of Kings. And so this might be a case where the traditional attribution, isn't that far from what is possible. Jeremiah is the son of Hilkiah, the priest who found the scroll. Written in the context of the era of Hezekiah and Josiah's reforms, the Deuteronomistic school anachronistically recasts history into that light. So like I say, it rewrites all of the previous history in order to especially approve of the reforms that are happening in their own day. That's quite normal for authors to write. Like I say, the context of every one of these books is always the context of the authors when they're writing, not the time period that they're trying to write about. So for exiles from the northern kingdom, from Samaria, who are living in Judah and writing under the patronage of the Davidic kings of Jerusalem, it makes sense to cast Israel and Judah as sister kingdoms. And it even makes more sense to tell your patron, King Hezekiah or King Josiah, hey guy, don't you remember that your eponymous ancestor, David, you're from the house of David, you're a descendant of this guy, David. He was the actual founder of Israel. It wasn't that Omri guy. And thus, actually, Jerusalem has a right to go and claim Bethel, that shrine of Bethel, because you're only retaking it. You're not invading what had been the northern kingdom. This kingdom, Judah, is the true heir of Israel. Has claim to the entire inheritance. And so there's a lot of advantages to why you would want to have the Davidic myth. The biblical narrative does acknowledge the house of Omri as rulers of the northern kingdom, which is both called Israel, not even though it's the bigger kingdom, not Judah. So, what had been the original kingdom centered on Jerusalem, according to the biblical account, it ceases to be called its original name, and the bulk of the kingdom that rebels, the 10 northern tribes, take the name with them, which is a strange thing to have happened anyway. So the biblical narrative acknowledges that thing. Omri and his son Ahab's Sidonian wife, Phoenician wife, Jezebel, and their sons, Ahaziah and Jehoram, are all viewed as really terrible villains from the perspective of the Deuteronomistic historian. And again, there would be an advantage to portraying these northern rivals as being the bad guys. The true good guys are the line that leads us to Hezekiah and Josiah. So, as a result, in addition to the kingdom, and we can't necessarily think that a lot of the David stories themselves have much historicity to them. So likely what was known at the time all of these biblical stories are being composed is that the kings of Judah are from a house called the house of David, and they presumed that they had an ancestor named David, but they may not have known much more other than his name. There could have been an oral tradition and some legends, but it's not clear how far back those legends would have gone. Some people have said, well, the stories of David are really embarrassing. You wouldn't tell a story like David's killing of Uriah the Hittite and taking his wife. You wouldn't tell a terrible story like that, or David's just failure in the rebellion of his son Absalom and so forth. That's been an argument for their historicity. But I would actually counter-argue that what probably we're dealing with here is that this is a courtly culture, and these are stories that are being told to entertain the royal court. And so rather than being stories that are talking about, that are remembered, let's say, about what David might have actually done, these are actually probably informed by the court that has occurred lately with Manasseh, or maybe the later years of Hezekiah when Hezekiah was in his dotage. And so these are just general court tropes and stories that would be interesting to courtiers. David, as a scrappy mercenary leader, may be informed by memories of Judah's relative level of strength in its relationship to the Old Kingdom of Israel, but there also may be just like hero stories, like Robin Hood stories and things like that, that also get put into their own part of the David's cycle. And so, before we conclude, which I'm wrapping up now, we go back now to this map, or this version of the map that I looked at when I was a little kid, of the Solomonic Empire stretching from the Euphrates to the border of Egypt. Where does this map come from? Was there ever in kind of this time period an empire that stretched across the western Levant from the Euphrates to Egypt? a dominion that was far more vast than even the Omrid dynasty of Israel, Samaria at its height. So Israel never owned anything like this. It might have had some dominion over Moab and Judah a little bit and so forth, but not anything bigger than that. And the answer is yes, this territory does largely correspond to a unit, a geographical unit that existed, but not in David's time, but instead in the time of Ezra, in the time of the Persian period, after the exiles have returned and the Bible is being edited together and created. Now suddenly this does correspond to a geographical unit, and that unit is called Ibernari, according to the Persians, or in the Greek we would say the trans-Euphratine satrapy. So the Persian Empire is divided into these vast geographical units called satrapies, and this is the unit that is the trans-Euphrates. So again, this emphasis on the border of the Euphrates. As far as the Babylonians are concerned, or the Persians, this is the area of the Fertile Crescent on the other side of the Euphrates, so the trans-Euphratine satrapy. And so this is, of course, the satrapy that the very small little province of Yehud, or Judea, is in. And so what's possible here is that the biblical editors, coming down to the time of Ezra, this is a geographical unit that they're aware of in their context, and this is the unit that they're then identifying with this golden age, a mythic time that under the mythic King Solomon. And so that is my sense then of the myth of David's kingdom. And as Mike is gathering your questions, I'm going to get a glass of water. All right. Well, I want to thank people who've been sending donations and your support. So I want to thank Dave Anderson, Crimson 90, Dartharama, No Mormon, No Cry, Certified Genius, Brad Stewart, Chromide, and JM. Thank you all for your support. That really is very welcome indeed. Thanks. Mike, could you increase the size? Winston Barkaz says, could we recover something about the historical David from the events of his life in the Psalms? I would love to, get a source text where I get a study of the Psalms. So some of the poetic work in the Bible, specifically poems that are embedded in the Deuteronomistic history. So there is a Song of Moses, there's a Song of Miriam. Some of these, there's a Song of Deborah in the book of Judges. Some of these are thought to be really old poems, old components. And so there are discrete old components and texts that are old. And it's likely that a bunch of different components of the Psalms in different places also include some old texts that have been gathered together, because the Psalms are a collection that are written all over the place in terms of what time. Some of them are much, much later. A bunch of the Psalms are ascribed to David, and so it says a Psalm of David. But I think scholars are pretty agreed that these are not actually composed by David. So this is those would be, the attribution of them to David is already after the Deuteronomistic histories have been written. And so David in those is understood to, for example, when he's young and he's in the court of King Saul, he plays his harp for Saul, and so this is how he's a psalmist. But no, I don't think that we can recover anything from the historical David from the Psalms, because, again, it's just like the David cycle in the Deuteronomistic histories. So there might be something preserved that goes back to a historical David, but it'd be hard-pressed to know what it is, because, again, it's all written so much later than than the time period when David would have lived. So the only argument for it is, if, like I said, if we did some kind of a really deep study of Psalms, which are poetry, and if there's an archaic Hebrew component that talks about an event in David's life. So in other words, not that it's attributed to David, but maybe it's about David, and then there could be something, but I think we'd have to look at that. So I don't think, offhand I'd say no, but I would like to look more at the Psalms. Ted Gemberling says, you don't think the succession narrative in Samuel Kings could be older. One thing that makes the succession narrative look older is that it's unflattering about David. Yeah, so yeah, Ted, I agree. This is what I was trying to argue with about the this criterion of embarrassment. There are a lot of things in the Deuteronomistic history, including, like you say, the succession narrative, that are unflattering. And so yeah, you in a certain point, you're wondering why, why would you kind of have these things where it looks like, well, David here, the Bible's at pains to say that David didn't just kill all of Saul's descendants, but he's sort of responsible for it. And the same thing at the end of his life and his dotage, when Solomon succeeds, all of these guys get massacred, and David's a terrible old king by the end. It's very unflattering. The rebellion of Absalom, the rape of Tamar, all of these things that happen. And so I guess my suggestion is, yes, the criterion of embarrassment has been used to say, well, why would you write that if that wasn't true? And my answer to that, or my suggestion to that is, well, perhaps here, this is not entirely meant as it's become a religious text. It was not written by priests the way the priestly source is writing in the Torah, and it's carrying all about all of these laws and rituals and rites and basins and all the kinds of regalia. Instead, it's a courtly narrative where people who are in a royal court know all of the kinds of intrigue that happens, especially succession narratives where once a king gets old, his power starts to slip from him. All of the different wives, each one of them is trying to push her son forward. They're all scheming with each other, rebelling. Maybe some son preemptively tries to get rid of his father, which happened a bunch of times in the David story. These are courtly narratives, and so David is far enough removed in the past that you can potentially write these things without getting in trouble for it, and it may well also be memories of things in the court that happened not too long ago. Let's say in these civil war times between Hezekiah and Manasseh, where there's big changes of policy. So that's why I think you could still have unflattering texts, which in any event are written so many hundreds of years after. It's not, they wouldn't have survived that way. So Mark Anthony says, what does John think of Gad Balneri's theory that Yahwism was totally unlike the Torah until incredibly late? Yeah, so we've had a whole lecture on when did the Torah become important? And so the Torah, so there's a couple of different questions here. So there is this idea that Deuteronomists are writing, there's an idea that the Torah writers are writing, where they have an idea of what they would like, but nothing like the lived religion is happening all around them at all. These are aspirational religious reforms. They want everyone to be like this. They write it back into the past as if it always had been like this and everybody had fallen away from it. But that is a normal, ancient way of thinking. Everybody believes in kind of a golden age that there's been a falling away from. And so we think we concluded in our lecture of when did the Torah become important. We decided that it was the evidence really is during the period of the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, which is, like you say, quite late. So past the Persian period and into the Hellenistic period is when this really starts to develop. So just So the argument there was that in fact the religion that Jesus grew up in, while it had a sense of itself as being very ancient indeed, had only begun to be practiced the way it was being practiced at Jesus' time. It was quite in flux pretty recently. So pretty late, like you say. Julie Brzezinski says, there are many lost books that are referenced in Chronicles. Do you think they all once existed? No. So I think that those do not exist at all. In fact, so Chronicles models itself on the Deuteronomistic histories, which occasionally cite books that I think did exist. I believe the Deuteronomists actually did have access to royal archives and annals. I think the chronicler doesn't have access to any of that, and instead only has access to the Deuteronomistic histories. And because the chronicler doesn't like the Deuteronomistic histories, thinks they're embarrassing and needs to be cleaned up, and is writing a new book that is intending to preserve the clean or good parts of the history, it pretends that it has all of these other sources to give itself legitimacy. But I don't think that it has any. And so I don't think that Chronicles even provides much in the way of a independent witness or anything like that. And so I think it's an interesting book in terms of showing what when a more priestly or more religious thinker gets a hold of a courtly text, which he finds to be very embarrassing, this is what that priestly reformer does to try to clean it up. That's what Chronicles is for me. Stephen Newton says, thoughts on David Rawls' new chronology. Rawls could be right or wrong, but I think the Egyptian timeline is probably incorrect. So I haven't researched David Rawls' new chronology, Stephen, so I can't comment on it really at all, but it's something I'll want to look into. Crimson 90, thank you for your support. Thoughts on David's house idols. Why leave that in if idol worship was so bad? Perhaps it's a story brought in from the northern refugees with a different hero, and Judah is just slapping David's name on it. So yeah, this is another thing. So I was talking about the criterion of embarrassment. So we're also not entirely probably dealing with, it's not just all one author. So there is, the Deuteronomistic school is combining a bunch of existing texts, also maybe existing legends, like you say. It may be that there is stuff that is already known, some of which have competing perspectives, northern exile perspectives, local Judahite perspectives. We know that as we've looked at the, the composition of the Torah itself, of the Pentateuch, we've seen that the Yahwist writer and the priestly writer are often pretty antagonistic with each other in terms of their treatment of some of the different characters and ideas and so forth. And so there's different ways to explain why that would be and how they could end up right next to each other. And one is that the earlier text was really important, but it couldn't be deleted, and a priestly author is simply adding their revision, or the other, that's a supplementary hypothesis, or it's a documentary hypothesis where the one existed and the priestly author wrote a rebuttal hoping to get rid of the earlier one, in the same way that the Chronicles book has been written to try to get rid of the Deuteronomistic history, maybe. So, like you say, that could be the reason, the one that you suggest. Nicola says, when it said Solomon built the millow, what is a millow? And I didn't look up what a millow is, so I'm sorry, we'll have to look it up. Julie Bazuski says, did pharaohs marry their daughters to other kings? I thought that never or rarely happened. So I think the first time we have a record of that is maybe the treaty after the Treaty of Kadesh, where the pharaoh actually has recognized the Hittite emperor as being worthy of that, and so yeah, I think that you're saying, it isn't something that was very common, especially early on, but by the time we're getting down to, so it's still probably seems probably unlikely by the time of Solomon. By the time we're getting down to Josiah's time, the Egyptians have been conquered by the Assyrians and so forth, and so the place of the pharaoh has been degraded, and so probably by the time the stories are getting written, it doesn't seem as impossible, but it's also again trying to elevate Solomon. It's showing that he is of that level, that he is having something happen that nobody has happen, and so it's saying that he had this empire that is more or less, it's like we're talking about the empire of Assyria or Babylon or Egypt or the Hittites. It's on that level. And so again, it's not likely to be, it's not something that happened historically. In the case of Solomon, for sure, where we don't have any evidence of him at all existing. But this is why it would have been created literarily. Wayne's World of Science and Technology says, I mentioned before that I was working on an essay on Deuteronomy. Shapira is causing me issues. Has John ever addressed the Shapira scrolls? See if I... So, okay. So I'm trying to think. So I think I have talked about this. So the Shapira scrolls are leather strips inscribed in Paleo-Hebrew script, and this was presented in the 19th century by a guy named Shapira. But I think it's almost immediately been denounced by scholars as a forgery. So I haven't, but I haven't looked at it, I think, any more deeply than that. I think I might have mentioned it when I've talked about, the different things that have happened when we have, on the one hand, recovered genuine new ancient texts that change our perspective on things, but then the problem that happens also is that everyone has a desire for it, and so people are producing forgeries. But I would have to look at it very particularly. Rain Weber. Dan McClellan seems to think that the earliest historically attested Jewish person in history was probably Josiah. Do you think anyone before the reforms of Josiah have a historical claim? So I haven't remembered, I had to look at that claim particularly, but Rain, I would suspect what Dan McClellan would be saying if he's saying that Josiah is the first Jewish person, is that he is making a distinction between Judaism as what we think of it as a religion, a monotheistic or religion, and people who are Judean ethnically. So there were ethnic Judeans. I've already showed you we have historical evidence for all kinds of kings of Judah, that is to say Judeans. The word Jew is the same. So we have, those are Jewish people in the sense of an ethnicity that is centered around Jerusalem, a little hill kingdom for a couple centuries that existed before the destruction of Jerusalem. So there are plenty of those, and they existed before Josiah. But perhaps what is meant here, until Josiah's reforms, until that book of Deuteronomy, which may be the earliest kind of Torah-like thing gets written, there can be, until you have a Torah, you don't have what we think of as a Jewish person. And so that's why he might, or someone might be suggesting that that's when we start having Jewish people. But it would be, it depends on what you're meaning by a Jewish person. And I would imagine that that's what they mean. In terms of an ethnicity, though, they were Jewish people or Judeans existed before Josiah. Hislang says, how do we know that Deuteronomist histories were being edited in the Persian period, and why isn't it clear if they were mostly written then? So some scholars argue that they are written in the Persian period, and some argue that they're written during the exile. And so the reason why I said I know that they're being edited still in the Persian period is that we have variants still that are already down to that. So the reason why in that text that I was able to read the Septuagint, the Greek translation of an early version of them that is missing verses compared to the one that in the Hebrew version that we have to this day, is that when somebody had a copy of it, nobody had added those extra verses, or somebody had deleted those extra verses. I think probably somebody was still adding them. And so there was so the fact that there's some variations, there's also some variations in the Samaritan Torah. It's not an independent witness that goes back to the kingdom of Samaria, but it is, they got a hold of their version of it before we got to the final version of the Hebrew Torah or the final version of the Septuagint Torah. And so sometimes the Samaritan Torah agrees with the Greek version against the Hebrew Torah, even though it's written in Samaritan Hebrew, Paleo Hebrew writing system. So there are variations, and so changes are still happening. There's also anachronisms that I think are still getting put in to some extent, but there's reasons that I've argued why maybe it's part of a writing program at the very end of the kingdom of Judah, and specifically because of this very august role it gives to this king Josiah, who doesn't actually end up really doing anything, ends up being kind of a failure. King K. Tempest Bradford, since scholars feel the unified kingdom of David didn't exist, is the story of King Saul perhaps meant to explain why there were eventually two kingdoms, or is Saul perhaps historical? So I haven't done a whole thing on Saul, but there are potentially other legendary figures. So Saul has, it's interesting, he has a kingdom. The boundaries that are described in the biblical account of Saul is actually kind of smaller. Saul's a Benjamite, I think. I got to look exactly at Saul and his story. But and so the idea of it is that there's some other kind of thing being preserved. I haven't, actually argued for why how that fits into the story necessarily, why that was important to the story. But it could just be part of, again, there could be a legend about it, or there could be part of a courtly narrative to have a rival and an antagonist for David. It depends on when kind of these stories kind of got their start. Zone Ghost. Isn't the Mesha Stele also where we get the account of child sacrifice by the king in order to defeat Yahweh? I don't know, does he actually say that he has a child sacrifice to Moloch to do that? I didn't read through the whole thing again. I was mostly just reading, I have to admit, the part where it mentions the different kings' names. So that would be interesting to go back and see what exactly what it's saying about the Moabite religion. Todd Radmaker says, does the number 40 have any significance outside of the Bible? I'm trying to think if, it's definitely a sacred number in the Bible, because in the Bible it signifies a generation. And when it's years, 40 years, and of course there's the 40 days and 40 nights for the flood. I think if there's anything in Greek and Roman mythology that has 40, it's not coming to me as anything. So I don't know. I don't have any associations that I'm making with it, but I think of it as like you say, a magic number for the biblical tradition. Ron Wagner says, when did Israel change to Samaria? So Samaria is it's another name for Israel. So both of these names are in use, because we can see in the different extra biblical records that sometimes the like the neighbors of Israel are calling the king so and so king of Israel. Sometimes they're saying he's king of Samaria. Sometimes they're saying he's king of the house of Omri, or the land of the people of Omri. And so these are just different synonyms for the same name. And so it changes. At some point or other, Samaria is not always the capital. There's more than one capital. So Shechem is a capital, and at different times the capital was moved. And so presumably it would only be called Samaria when the capital was there. And then definitely in the once the once the kingdom of Israel is conquered by the Assyrians actually divide it into 3 provinces. So they take Megiddo, which is an important city in the northern part, Gilead, which is the part across the Jordan, and then Samaria, and they divide it into 3 provinces. And at that point, and from that point forward into the Persian period, Samaria is the kind of rump part of Israel, which is the part that is just immediately north of Judah. And so definitely by the time of the Persian period, the Judeans are calling Samaria, Samaria, because they don't want to call it Israel, because they want to claim that they're Israel. And so that's why I think today, for clarity, we always call it Samaria. Brother Bill says, how would the modern day Samaritans that live in the Levant fit into this history of the kingdoms of Judah and of Israel? So, Brother Bill, we've done a whole history of the Samaritans that takes us all the way back from the ancient kingdom of Israel, Samaria, all the way through all of these different periods, and brings it up to the present day. But just I'll give you kind of a thumbnail or shorthand answer here, which is the Samaritans consider themselves to be the true heirs of the ancient northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Samaria. And so they've preserved their own separate Israelite religion that is not the same as Judaism. So Judaism is also a Israelite religion. This is another Israelite religion, Samaritanism. And so therefore it's part of, the same Abrahamic family of religions, but it's down to just a couple hundred members, a few hundred people that are left among the Samaritans. And so they fit into that, and they're down to that few because they also had their own rebellions against the Romans and were killed. And then in the course of many, many years of living under Muslim rule, they stopped the practice of converting anybody. And so as a result, there's very few left. Thank you, Zone Ghost, for your support. Elpidio Gonzalez says, epic song stories of Saul, a follower of the god Baal, survived in the northern kingdom of Israel and are later incorporated into Samuel, who followed the god El. David, Elnath, followed El. So who was the first Yahwist? So yeah, there are lots of books that kind of try to trace the origin of Yahwism, and there are different theories of how it comes to be, because how is it that this name that doesn't exist in the pantheon for a while suddenly becomes important as the centralizing name that gets merged with the older sky godfather El, whose name becomes synonymous just with the generic word God. So El equals Yahweh at a certain point. He then takes the characteristics of Baal, but in the biblical tradition is opposed to Baal, so not without taking the name, and ultimately also incorporates the characteristics and maybe absorbs the being of his consort Asherah. So the development of that, if you're going to try to go back to who was the first people that are promoting a cult, a worship of Yahweh, we have done a long time ago a couple lectures on this, and Leandro has actually done some lectures on this, and we're going to have to, I think, update those and do another lecture on that as well. K. Tempest Bradford says, have you heard of Dr. Robert Cargill's theory that Hezekiah destroyed the Ark of the Covenant along with all of the other stuff, and then later scribes left out later copies of the books? If so, what do you think of that theory? That doesn't seem very likely to me, because what I think that is happening is that I think that there is a shrine, and maybe it's called the Ark of the Covenant, and I don't know that it would have contained, anything like the kinds of traditions or a Torah or anything like that, because I think that the book that gets found by it is the thing that created the idea that there had been the older covenantal stuff. So I don't think anything had to get destroyed in order to impose new meaning on something that would have previously been just a regular pagan style shrine thing, an Ark of the Covenant that existed within the shrine that is a temple not only to Yahweh but to Asherah and Baal and El and all the other gods originally. Videos for stuff, probably mostly unlisted, says, people often compare Hilkiah's finding Deuteronomy to Joseph Smith's finding the golden plates, either to justify Mormonism or to troll mainline Christians. Do you see these stories as comparable? So I think that there is something comparable to both stories, which is when you're dealing with religion and religious reform, in a lot of cases, people don't see value in, let's say, if you start to introduce, I have this new idea, we're going to do this brand new thing, and it's going to be something that's really important to us and really sacred to us. It is very hard to launch something like that and get it off the ground and have anybody value it. And it was even more difficult in antiquity, where there is kind of a reverence for an ancient golden age that we've all fallen away from. And so things that are time-honored traditions and things like that, things that are grounded in what our ancestors understood, those are automatically understood to have authority and value. And so indeed, almost all of the tradition of scripture writing, we've looked at, for example, we had a lecture fairly recently on how the book of Daniel is written so many hundreds of years after when Daniel would have lived, but is ascribed to the earlier name Daniel in order to have it get authority. And that's simply one of a very large apocalyptic tradition that is happening in Second Temple Judaism, where people are writing books of Enoch. We've looked at those. Again, this antediluvian patriarch, and now you're writing a book, and your visions that you're saying, these are the visions that Enoch had thousands of years ago. By giving it the authority of Enoch, that makes people more interested in it. So what Joseph Smith is doing in terms of if that is actually very, very similar. It's he has a religious calling. He wants to have people in America know their place in the world. He wants to be able to explain things that biblical literalists can't explain. Why would there be all of these animals and people here in the Americas if there was really a universal flood at the time of Noah and all the animals got off the ark over in Mount Ararat? Why are there animals over here? And so forth. He wanted to give a place into the biblical worldview for Native American peoples. And so in creating new books of scripture that are building on, let's say, biblical antiquity, including he also had a book where he had visions of Moses, writings of Abraham. These are creating scripture and giving it antiquity for the purpose, for religious purposes. And that is not intensely different from all of the pseudepigraphal books, including ones that made it into the Bible, like Daniel, ones that made it into the Bible, like the epistles of Peter and so forth, in the Second Temple period. Or going back to the First Temple period, it's not substantially different from Hilkiah finding Deuteronomy. Again, there's a religious reform that is being justified and being written into narrative. Yes. Dark Sorian says, I want to know more about the time period before the Hasmoneans, before the Maccabees. So the Torah was just a book on the shelf. Was it still 80% paganism everywhere with a struggling temple trying to spread monotheism? So so not necessarily mean that everything was paganism and people were struggling to spread monotheism. What we're talking about, though, is that so there were different practices that might have been somewhat widespread, although not what we later understood to be rabbinic Judaism. And there were different things that defined Judean identity, but they weren't all of the things that later we understood in the Hasmonean period. And yeah, the Torah wouldn't have been known for lots and lots of people. We've shown how lots of these traditions up until the Maccabean period, they're not actually, there's independent traditions that really aren't referencing it. So the Jewish wisdom tradition is not making all of these references to the Torah and things until much later in the tradition than the earlier part of the wisdom tradition. So that doesn't mean it's still 80% paganism everywhere, although some Judeans in that period are clearly worshiping multiple gods. Maybe not as much in the land, but certainly ones in exile in Egypt are shown to be in a couple places. So yeah, we did a lecture on this, and I would be much more familiar with it. I was looking at each in different period if you go back to that one, but it's something that becomes really important to the identity in the Hasmonean period. I wouldn't though say paganism. They're more focused on monolatry already in the Persian period, but maybe not with all the rest of it that we're understanding. Certainly not focused on Torah. Mank Deems says, there is more recent historical parallels with the ethnogenesis of the West Saxons taking on English identity to claim the right to the former English kingdoms of the Danelaw in modern England. So there you go. Mank Deems, that was really great. I started out with a completely, seemingly unrelated map of the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy and then one of the Danelaw, and you were able to immediately have a perfect parallel with the kingdom of Judah claiming Israelite identity the same way the West Saxons claimed that they're English in order, like you say, to claim all of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in order to create England. So it's a perfect analogy. Very good, thank you. Bible Lore Podcast. On my podcast, Kip Davis has noted the similarity between Josiah and Joshua's names and the desire for northern land. Do you see much there? That's an interesting idea. So Joshua is the northern hero, right? And Caleb is the southern hero. And Josiah, like you say, is the southern king who is actually, for the first time, extends the border of Judah into the what had been Israel and then had later been Assyrian Israel. And so is there there? And I don't know. That's an interesting idea. That's something, I've never thought of that before. Normative says, it occurs to me that the criterion of embarrassment and such assume a very sort of rationalistic Homo economicus model of how stories originate and propagate. It assumes the alternatives are historical or consciously crafted to serve an intelligible agenda, which does not seem to exhaust the alternatives. Exactly. So that's why I was suggesting that you can, there are reasons to write embarrassing stories which are not only because you have to admit to them because they were history. So you're exactly right. Okay. Well, thank you so much for this great YouTube live chat. Everybody's been so engaged. There were so many really excellent questions and observations, lots to think about. Please come with us next Tuesday when we talk about what are saints? What were saints? What are they today?